It's The Real News. I'm Ben Norton. This is part two of my discussion with the Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. In part one, we discussed how on Thursday, April 26th, Jill Stein agreed to a request by the Senate Intelligence Committee to submit documents and emails and campaign materials to the committee for an investigation. What's interesting about this story, Jill, is, of course, many corporate media outlets have attacked you and the Green Party. But one of the things that's been very misleading is that there's this myth that you oppose an investigation into Trump. But actually, you have said very clearly, and in the press release that you published, you called for a, quote, legitimate inquiry into corruption, quid pro quo deals, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and other illegal activity in the 2016 election. Can you expand?
Definitely. And just for the record, to clarify, we put out a press release today, Thursday, April 26th, because now we have essentially concluded our handover of materials. So we've been turning over materials for the past couple of months and have finally completed that process. And in doing so, we're breaking our silence. We've been quiet while the process has gone on. And at this point, we're sort of stepping back to comment on the process as someone who's been a target of Russiagate. And as you point out, I have, in my campaign, feels like there is a valid purpose in finding out, in lifting the veil here and finding out what went on in the election and what illegal activity took place in the way of corruption, quid pro quo deals, et cetera, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and we've seen a steady stream of this. I think I may be the exception among those who've been investigated in that there's not a money stream here. There's not even a trickle or a drop of money changing hands. But, Paul Manafort money laundered some $80+ million and so on. That's sort of, there's a lot of money changing hands here. And, or Jared Kushner, who received oodles of money in loans from various companies that then got perks by way of forgiving regulations that they didn't want to restrict their development of pipelines and so on. So there's a lot of very untoward stuff coming to light here. It's unfortunate that it took a special investigator to look into this because, or that it's just restricted to the Trump campaign, because this, unfortunately, as we know so well, this is that swamp, which has only grown deeper under Donald Trump, but that swamp is really well established. And personally, I value that part, particularly the Mueller investigation, because there is a really valid investigation going on now of this corruption, to put it, to put a blanket term on it. That's really good. But on the other hand, you don't want Russiagate being misused and overreaching to where it becomes a tool for promoting censorship and warmongering and the oppression of independent third political parties, opposition parties, which is also how it's being used. And it's become, in the Democrats, the DNC's effort to distract from the very disturbing revelations of the DNC leaks, suddenly they had to really change the topic, and it was, it became Russia 24/7. And there are lots of allegations out there of collusion, et cetera. But in terms of solid proof, I am certainly not convinced. A lot of skeptical analysts, I think I've heard you point out real problems with the collusion theories. On the other hand, corruption, there's plenty of, and it's important that that corruption be addressed. And the fact that there was apparent obstruction in Donald Trump's effort, to prevent the firing and investigation into his national foreign advisor, and his efforts to dismiss Comey and his actual dismissal of James Comey, the FBI director, and so on. So there was certainly an appearance of obstruction of justice, which is also illegal and demands investigation. So in that sense, I in the campaign have very much been supporting that legitimate function of the investigations, but objecting vehemently to the intrusion on our basic civil liberties, on the reckless and dangerous warmongering that's going on, and the censorship, which has really been ramped up based on extremely shoddy evidence around Russian social media intervention through the Russian Internet Research Agency. It's actually laughable compared to what real intervention looks like, in Cambridge Analytica, and the Facebook scandal is really kind of the poster child of what real social media intervention and meddling looks like.
Yes, let's talk about that really quickly. A few points to hit. One, you mentioned corruption allegations, and there's no doubt in my mind, and I think we've seen some reporting that Trump had shady business in Russia. Of course, he also had extremely shady business deals and practices in the Gulf, specifically in the UAE. Also, now we know we see both the Kushners and the Trumps potentially implicated in shady business in India, China, and elsewhere. But moving on to Cambridge Analytica, of course, that's the elephant in the room. In the past few weeks, we've seen some serious investigation into Cambridge Analytica's actual work, hacking the U.S. election, if you will. And even beyond that, I know the Green Party, as you have repeatedly stressed, is in fact the only party that has called for an investigation into potential voting machine hacking in the 2016 presidential election. So can you talk about the forms of potential alleged election interference, whether it be hacking of voting machines, whether it be the corporate control over these voting machines, and whether it be Cambridge Analytica, that are not getting enough attention? While we hear all these reports about Russiagate, we don't see as much investigative reporting into other things. You can also, of course, mention cross-check and voter repression, which has, even though the Democrats have in the past paid lip service to this, I don't really see people talking about cross-state cross-check anymore, interstate cross-check.
Exactly. In the same way that Russiagate has sort of become the obsession. Turn on MSNBC, which Norman Solomon nicknamed MSDNC. It's like 24/7, Russia, Russia, Russia. Let's not talk about, the outrageous Trump package. Let's not talk about the authorization for use of military force, which essentially betrays congressional responsibility for declaring war and overseeing war and so on. We're not talking about anything here, and that includes the whole issue of election interference. Election interference is not just Russia, Russia, Russia. Although great powers do this, and certainly Russia is trying to interfere in our elections. I have no doubt, although I haven't seen the evidence for it, but one can presume that's going on in the same way that the US is doing the same. And there's this whole reciprocity thing here, which is also completely left out of the picture. And, elected officials are talking about this as if this is a one-way street, when in fact it's been very well established that it's generally been the US, which is head and shoulders ahead of Russia in terms of interfering in foreign elections. We have done this forever, and we've been way ahead in Russia in the track record for doing so. And so the issue here, in my view, there are several issues that are conflated in the so-called Russia investigations. And supposedly this is supposed to improve our confidence in our elections. I don't think our confidence in our elections is exactly improving. We're not seeing things resolved. And, then you have the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook scandal, basically where you're seeing data on 87 million people being weaponized, being micro-targeted with manipulative messaging and so-called psychological operations at a military scale. And, we haven't begun to really scratch the surface to know exactly what's going on here, but it looks extremely nefarious and powerful relative, with something like thousands of data points, up to thousands of data points on each of 87 million people in order to intervene in the election. So this looks like, interference on steroids, actually. And as Greg Palast has pointed out, Cambridge Analytica is just one of many such, or at least several such organizations, including Karl Rove's so-called Data Trust, and the Koch brothers have their own version of this. So there's a lot of data out there that has loads of information on us, which is essentially being weaponized for the purpose of interfering in our elections. And this is really quite outrageous. Let me also acknowledge, there's the whole background issue of money in politics. The same guy, Robert Mercer, who funded, essentially the main funder for Cambridge Analytica, which has so distorted, or appears to have really distorted, our election process, is the same guy who funded Citizens United, which opened the floodgates to the interference of big money throughout the rest of the election process. So the process is extremely corrupted at many levels. You have big media that gave away the store to Donald Trump. Over $3 billion worth of extra primetime media given to Donald Trump because he was, quote, damn good for CBS corporate profits. Not just CBS, obviously, but that was the statement of Les Moonves, the CEO of CBS, who just said out front, he may not be good for America, but he sure is damn good for CBS, So is that the basis on which candidates are elevated to the highest service of our public airwaves? We should be reclaiming the public airwaves and making them available essentially at no cost. These are public airwaves which should be part of public service, and they should be available to ballot qualified candidates that candidates need to know about. We should be opening up our debates and have inclusive debates so that the American people not only have a right to vote, we have a right to know who we can vote for. So to summarize, we're calling for an emergency commission. The midterms for 2018 are rapidly approaching, and we're not exactly minding the store here and addressing the threats, and there are so many of them. We should have a nonpartisan commission rather than the partisan commissions we currently have in Russiagate, which are representing the two parties. But most Americans don't identify, or shall we say the plurality, the largest group of Americans don't identify with one or the other of the major parties. We should have an emergency commission for election protection and voting justice that ensures that every American has not only the right to vote, but the right to a vote that we can trust, that is accurate, secure, and just, and free from the scourge of Jim Crow in our elections.
Well, unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. Thanks so much for joining us. This is The Real News, and we were interviewing Jill Stein, who was the presidential candidate for the Green Party in both 2012 and 2016. Thanks for speaking with us, Jill.
Great to talk with you, Ben. Thanks so much.
For The Real News, I'm Ben Norton.